Okay, welcome to another episode of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm normally joined by Thomas Dimitrov. Thomas has been out for a few weeks, so we'll get him back, I believe, in about a week to 10 days. But it's just me today. We've had some really good shows on the feed this week. Monday, myself, Tage Seth, Parker Fleming, we took coaches in a coaching draft, which was quite cool. People were understandably angry, I think, that there was no Bill Belichick to go in the first few rounds. Tage ended up taking him in the fourth round, and then on Wednesday, Tage and Parker, who have been filling in about once a week for me and Thomas, they had Bill Connolly, one of the really good people in the football analytics space, specifically the college football analytics space, to really sort of talk about his metrics, his process. It's a really good follow. I think Bill was one of those people when I was at Pro Football Focus and we made numbers for college football. I always wanted to make sure that I was directionally similar to Bill because he just I think has his finger on the pulse insofar as college football, and so go back and listen to that one. We've obviously we got Manscaped as a sponsor. We're getting another sponsor this summer, which is going to be really cool, and we're going to start coming out with some content. By the way, if you go to sumersports.com, it'll prompt you to sign up for an email newsletter that we'll be sending out in the near future. So that's kind of all of the things that I wanted to talk about here, at least originally. Before I talk about the league news, now it's kind of dark here. Actually, I'm at a friend. I'm in a condo in Florida right now. It's actually raining right now, and there wasn't great lighting all week anyway. So I do apologize for that. Unlike last week, where we had Matt Collar on this Friday show talking about his book, Football is a Numbers Game. I'm just going to go through the news again, much like a couple weeks ago. And there were some big news items, and it caused us, I think, a little bit as a community to sort of talk about some things that we've been talking about for a long time, at least in football analytics and football in general. And the first one was that the Vikings did finally release Dalvin Cook. Just to bring up Dalvin's numbers here as far as what he's costing here. Dalvin Cook, with a post June 1 cut, and at sumersports.com, we have an article about what the post June 1 deadline actually means. It means that all prorated money, in this case for Cook, it's that 2024 dead money charge that you see on the right-hand side in the pink, $3.1 million. That is what the Vikings ended up saving by waiting until June 1st to either trade or cut him. If they would have waited before June 1st, that $3.1 million would have been accelerated to the 2023. Now, people will say, "Oh, what's $3 million? You'd rather have Dalvin Cook on the team than have that $3 million." Well, what the Browns showed last year is that money can obviously be rolled over as long as you're above the certain threshold for spending every year. You can roll over that money into the following year, and if there's no other use for it, right? And so it's funny, but like dead money, of course, decreases in its onerousness as the years progress. Cap space obviously decreases as well because the value of the cap goes up. So it might not be worth as much next year, but at least they gave themselves the option to use it this year. So that's what they're doing there. And, for the people who say Dalvin Cook, is a pretty good back still. This is my colleague Tage Seth, who often hosts the show with me. This is rushing yards over expected, which is an estimate based upon some pre-play, but also, things like down and distance and all that. There are some versions of it that'll take on PFF grades, or other versions of it that will take on, the position of the blockers and stuff like that. Dalvin Cook is simply not a good running back anymore as far as running the football. And it's weird because, usually when a running back loses it, they lose their speed and stuff like that. In the case of Dalvin Cook, it wasn't so much that he lost the speed. I mean, we saw him break off a long run against the Miami Dolphins at Hard Rock. We saw them break off an 80-yard run to help the Vikings come back from a 17-point deficit against Buffalo. Catch a screen pass, take it to the distance to tie the game, I think, against Indianapolis in that, that crazy comeback that they had. it's not so much that he doesn't have the speed, it's that he can't break tackles anymore. And I think a shoulder injury where he didn't get it repaired, properly was part of that. But he simply can't make people, if he can't make somebody miss, he can't gain yardage. And I think that doesn't grow particularly well as you get older. The Vikings with, general manager Kwesi Adafo-Mensah, opt to go into the season with a very running backs don't matter kind of analytically optimal room of Alexander Madison making the $3.5 million per year over two, a pretty effective runner when he's had an opportunity, a very good receiver out of the backfield. You kind of pay for knownness there where, ultimately he's sort of taking on that, if he can't be the actual bell cow guy, he can at least be pass protector guy. He can be blitz pickup guy when they really need him on late yardage or late down and long yardage situations. And then if he, somebody between Ty Chandler, a second-year player from North Carolina, Kene Nwangwu from Iowa State, who's been a very good kick returner, 3 touchdowns during his first 2 seasons. Dwayne McBride, a guy that they just drafted from UAB, a very good runner, does really well in a lot of the metrics. I think that they'll be able to fish together a very good running back group out of that room. And when you think about their offense now, Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson needs to, obviously get signed. I don't think he'll step on the field again for the Vikings until he has a contract. And KJ Osborne, along with TJ Hawkinson, another guy that they kind of have to make a decision about whether to extend this year or wait until next year. An offensive line with 2 good tackles. Garrett Bradbury emerged a little bit last year. That's going to be a pretty good offense. And I think people are going to be surprised at how little they miss Cook, to be honest with you, just because he wasn't particularly great last year, save for a few explosive plays. So that's one piece of news. Obviously this is meant to be for a while. One of the reasons they took this long, and just to give you guys an idea, is that if you want to trade a player, you can't designate them a post June 1 cut, right? So again, when we look at Dalvin Cook's stuff there, they would have, so they saved $9 million with this cut. If they would have traded him before the June 1st deadline, they can't designate that post June 1. And so from that perspective, you can always cut a guy post June 1 and then you get the money after June 1, but you can't trade a player for that same effect. So they were certainly holding out hope for a trade. Once that never materialized, once it got past June 1st, it never really, worked out that way for the Minnesota Vikings. So they ended up releasing him. The next piece of news also involves the Minnesota Vikings, which is kind of interesting. I think one of the reasons, obviously, is because they've struggled a little bit with their identity, and now they're kind of this is a rebuilding mood. The next question you have to have is for a guy like Danielle Hunter. So this is Danielle Hunter, who has been under some talks for trades. This is his kind of whole contract here. The 2018 extension that was basically a 5-year, $78 million deal. We're on basically the 6th year of that deal. Maybe it was a 6-year deal, or I can't remember if they extended it or not. But this is currently the deal. Obviously, you see the early years, which were a huge value to the Vikings, and then now you have this final year, which is kind of this conundrum. It's a $13 million cap hit for the Vikings. There are $11.2 million in voids still left. But Danielle Hunter's only seeing $4.9 million in base salary, as well as about $600,000 in bonuses, roster and workout bonuses this year. So really $5.5 million of new money. That would be what they save in a post June 1st cut. In which case the dead money that they'd have to deal with is that $7.62 million. And then because we're past June 1st, the 5.62 just gets prorated as dead next year. That again, that's the conundrum that the Vikings are in. Danielle Hunter has really deserved a big contract. When you look at his play, the only thing to get worried about, this is my old employer PFF. I feel no negativity towards using their data because it is very good. Just looking here at his stuff now, he missed the 2020 pandemic year. He missed the second half of 2021, but he was incredibly productive in those seasons. And then he came back last year, really struggled out the gate, about 3 pressures per game, kind of the first half of the season, but then he really turned it on. And when you look at 76 pressures and 605 pass rushing snaps, it's a 12.5% pressure rate. that's not as good as what he had in 2019, where he had 97 pressures in 616 pass rushing snaps. That was a career high 15.7% pressure rate, at least since he became a starter. So he's still not back to kind of his peak, but this is a very good edge defender. And one of the things that I studied when I was at PFF, as far as the tracking data and the get off rates and things like that. If you want to look at that, go ahead and look at my Sloan paper from 2022. Danielle Hunter is one of those guys. He doesn't get off the ball that quickly. He's not like people think of him as a freak athlete, but he doesn't necessarily get off the ball that fast. He does, however, obviously finish plays. I think that there's a couple things that gives rise to. A, he's probably later on in his career going to be a very good secondary defensive end, outside linebacker, so a pass rusher in that way. But B, I think he will age well. I mean, if you're not dependent so much on athleticism to get by, if you're good with your moves and things like that, like I think you can age better. So it's weird. Hunter's never been a lone person in this Vikings defense, maybe except for 2019. Everson Griffin was very much there with him. 2018 was the year that Everson Griffin kind of fell off for a little bit, came back, had his personal issues. But like for the most part, 2015, through 2019, he's working with Everson Griffin. 2021, he was working with Everson Griffin. And then 2022 last year, obviously Zadarius Smith was there. Zadarius Smith very much like overshadowed him in the first half of the year. And then Hunter sort of surpassed him in terms of production later on. So I can see both. I can see a lot of the reasons why the Vikings might want to move on, because again, as we look at Hunter's, money, he's expensive to the Vikings, right? He's still $13 million. That's cheap for a guy as good as him, but it's still not an inexpensive thing. There's not a whole lot you can do to reduce his cap number with an extension, because you're going to have to tack on more bonus money. That's $7.62 million, and each of those $5.62 million in the void years. And sorry, I misspoke a little bit. Next year he would count $11.24 million dead, because the void years happen pre-June 1. So it's actually 11. So he costs $24 million in cap, in cap space the next 2 years. And yet, you look at that base salary, it's only 4.9, there's only 5.5. You're going to have to give him a weird looking deal, a long-term deal, to sort of smooth this out and have him not be more expensive this year to the Vikings, which really hurts, I think, because they still have to sign Justin Jefferson. They don't have a ton of cap space to begin with. They still have to sign Justin Jefferson. They still have to, in theory, get a TJ Hawkinson deal done. Now that one might help them with relief, because the fifth-year option tag for a guy like him is not necessarily inexpensive. But that's certainly something to think about when you're looking at what the Minnesota Vikings have to do with Danielle Hunter. What's really funny, again, is, again, going back to Hunter stats, one of the things to look at if you're looking at Pro Football Focus and pressures is you want to, if a guy's a defensive end or outside linebacker, like an edge player, you want him to have more pressures, more than 10% of his pass rushes be pressures. That's kind of what I would consider to be a minimal viable pass rusher. Hunter's well over that for the most part, for the majority of his career. So that's been very good. He's gotten, even his comeback year this year, being able to play almost 1,000 snaps, which is almost a career high, and get, be involved in 13 sacks, 12 hits, 76 total pressures. That was a very good thing. There was another player that came up on, sort of the trade rumors this week, and that is Chase Young. Now, this is Chase Young numbers. And take a step back for a sec. For one, the Commanders decided to decline his fifth-year option, which would have been $17 million. The reason it was $17 million was because he did make a Pro Bowl in year one. And so even though he's a top 10 pick, it went by sort of that escalator there. It was actually not that expensive if you're talking about a top tier edge player. The problem is I think other than draft position, there's really not a ton sort of in the way of evidence that Chase Young is a top tier pass rusher. If you look at, for example, his pressure rate here, 42 pressures, even in his Pro Bowl year out of 498 snaps, that's only a pressure rate of about 8.5%. In year two, it's 24 pressures in almost 300 snaps. Pass rushing, that's still 8%. So kind of consistent one year to the next. He didn't really play last year much. And even when he did, that was 11% pressure rate, which is better. Certainly better, but in a small sample, like I don't think Chase Young has actually been productive enough to warrant, the 5th-year option. But the question becomes, can you make it worth his while to bring him in via trade? Because for Washington, they're not really unloading that much. It's just his 4th-year salary as a player who's been taken, 2nd overall. And so, they're not necessarily unloading a ton. So I don't know necessarily if they have, is it worth it for them to save 11 million? I think at 11 million, Chase Young is certainly a value on the field. And as a team going to come in thinking they get 1 year of Chase Young at 11 million, 11 million, and some of it's prorated bonus. So it's really going to be, a pretty cheap deal for a team that's trading, right? So you have probably, and I don't know if that roster bonus has been paid out yet, but he only has a $1 million base. So the team that acquires him, there is an edge there. We talk about with Hawkinson, we talk about it with Orlando Brown, players like that, where players who are highly drafted, who are available, if you can send over a high pick, like a 2nd, for example, you're going to get a player who's being paid almost nothing because it's all, it's all prorated stuff and very little base salary. And you get that player on that very reduced salary, and you get them for just a short time, and then you have to extend them or let them go. And letting them go for a comp pick is oftentimes a much better move than simply re-signing them, which might be one of the reasons why the Vikings are balking on Hawkinson. So with the Chase Young thing, you really have to ask yourself, okay, after a year and a half really of injuries, after a performance in 2020, which wasn't terribly strong. I think that it's a really good question. I think you really have to trust your player eval here. We know that high draft picks, we know that signal carries. So there might be a team that's willing to belly up and give Washington what they want. Maybe it's one of those things where if Washington gets into kind of that, certain part of training camp and Sam Howell and Jacoby Brissett are so bad, they want to get a quarterback. Maybe Chase Young is a bargaining chip there. But those are two great contrasts. Hunter's been very productive. I expect him to be productive in the future. But he needs a new contract. The Vikings are going to be hell bent to give him one. And Chase Young, who also needs a new contract, probably hasn't earned one yet. What would he be worth in a trade? Ron comes in here. Eric, Christian Darrisaw is also doing an extension. That's actually not true. Christian Darrisaw was drafted in 2021. He has a whole season. Now they can extend him after next year, 2024. They can extend him. But yeah, I mean, Christian Darrisaw is an all-pro type player. So when you think about him, you think about Hawkinson, you think about Justin Jefferson, you think about Kirk Cousins, that core of the Minnesota Vikings, they're going to have to make some choices because in the past, not to besmirch the old GM, but like they refused to make tough choices back when Rick Spielman was the GM. And now they're in a situation where Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has a lot of tough decisions. And I know he didn't necessarily take cutting Dalvin Cook. It wasn't probably fun for him, right? I don't think guys like doing that. So, those are a couple pieces of news here. It's an interesting time. I think Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, branded the Dalvin Cook decision as an analytics decision. And while I'd love for our community to be able to take credit for that, I think it's just a little bit of like one guy's being paid top 3 in the league at his position. He's not top 3 in the league at his position anymore. And there's a lot of other things that this team has to do. Sign Justin Jefferson, possibly sign Hawkinson, possibly sign Hunter, that needed to be done to save that $9 million. And now that $9 million can be applied to some other things, namely getting the best wide receiver in the NFL under contract for as long as possible. Speaking of best wide receiver in the NFL, now he doesn't have that distinction anymore, but we've talked about DeAndre Hopkins a bunch on the show. What's really funny, and we talked about this actually on SumerSports.com. Go to SumerSports.com, sign up for the Zone. Give us, if you just with a simple email, you'll be able to sign up for all newsletter, and that will be a driving force for us to get you to our content during the course of the season, which we're really excited about. This is one on why hasn't DeAndre Hopkins been traded yet? And it's a very good question. He wasn't traded. He was released, and now he's free to sign with anybody. There was a discussion about, this arms race, sort of in the between the Bills and the Chiefs. But, from what I can tell, and talking to the people I talk to, I think they called and asked. I don't think that I don't think there's much of a back and forth between the Cardinals and the Chiefs or the Bills. And I don't think there's really much of a back and forth between the Cardinals, the Hopkins group now that he's a free agent, and the Chiefs and the Bills either. I think Hopkins is in a really tough spot where Odell got the biggest contract. The Ravens were willing to pay up so he would make a decision. And Hopkins probably should ask for that much money, but I don't think there's that many teams that have that money in the banana stand right now. There are a lot of people who are saying, well, you can easily make this money, but you have to look at the way in which teams spend cash and the way in which teams like to allocate the resources. And a team like for example, the Chiefs, they simply don't, they have too many other things they have to spend cash on to really think about Hopkins, even though, yes, they could make the room. Most teams can make the room for any deal that they want to. It amounts to whether the owner wants to put that money in escrow and whether the team wants to handle that risk long term as to whether or not, that player, ends up being on that team. So very, interesting week, like I said, of things. I do want to answer some listener questions. Actually, let's just go ahead and take one from Brian here. How does the transition from Brian Flores 3-4 scheme impact Hunter's value for the Vikings? Does he fit a 3-4 scheme? Or is that perhaps the Vikings move Hunter for picks? Like, that's a good question, Brian. Like, last year Ed Donatel ran a 3-4. So Hunter has been standing up as an outside linebacker for a year now. And there was, I thought, like some discussion of whether or not that was part of his struggles early in the season when he wasn't getting as much pressure. But from the perspective of Hunter, it's going to be the same. He's going to be standing up. And most teams now, like just kind of an inside baseball, like back in like 2006, about 2/3 of plays were in traditional base defenses. So 3-4s or 4-3s, in which case there was truly a difference between, whether you were a stand-up OLB or a down defensive end, because you would, if you were one of the outside linebackers that was supposed to drop in coverage, like it was just something you did all the time. And even rushing from stand-up is a little bit tricky. Now, it's funny because when Hunter was a rookie, he rushed from stand-up a lot, and that was what he felt comfortable with. He looked pretty comfortable at the end of the season last year, but that's a good question. The thing now is, though, like more than 2/3 of plays are now running nickel. And from the, not that many teams run 3-3-5 nickel that much. So usually it's either, if you're a 4-3 team, you run a 4-2-5 nickel, in which case the two defensive ends play the exact same role essentially as a 2-4-5 nickel, which 3-4 teams play, where those two stand-up outside linebackers are effectively the pass rushers. So for a lot of the NFL, the distinction between being a stand-up player in a 3-4 and being a hand-in-the-grass player in a 4-3 is a little bit overblown. But that's a good question because, they are undergoing some changes. But it's not a change. It's more of a change for some of the secondary players, and probably one of the reasons why the Vikings didn't hang on to Duke Shelley or Patrick Peterson, because they were better zone corners and they wouldn't necessarily be able to fit into the man scheme. I'm not sure about Shelley. There's such a low sample on him, but I know Peterson, the prevailing wisdom was that he would get cooked in a more man-heavy scheme. And that's kind of really where I think the changes are and why they went out and got Byron Murphy with inside-outside flexibility rather than getting Peterson as a sort of an older corner. This is a really good question. Sean Donahue, a very good follow on Twitter, by the way, is playing a more aggressive style of defense when you have lesser talent and experienced players plus EV, i.e., do you want to create variance when you have a weaker defense? Thank you for this question. Now, I hope go to sumersports.com, go ahead and look at our weak link systems article. Go look at our article about wide receivers and man and zone. I think it's, historically, the answer has been the exact opposite, actually. And if you are a weaker defense, what you want to do is play more zone. And the reason is because zone defense, generally speaking, extracts the actual talent differences between wide receivers and secondary players less efficiently than man does. And so one example that I came across, in our data was, when the Ravens were really playing good, under Wink, when they were really killing 2018, 2019 or so, they would kill teams, and they would, when their margin of victory in 2019 was huge. 2018, even I remember the game against the Titans, they had like 11 sacks. When you have a talent advantage and you run man coverage as a defense, it exacerbates that difference in talent. If you have a deficit, so like whenever they would play Kansas City, they would get absolutely roasted because it was the one team that could beat their man coverage with Tyreek Hill, guys like that, even McCole Hardman with his deep speed, Sammy Watkins. And so like, I think man coverage exacerbates the differences between two teams. So if you're the better team, you should play man, because then what's the expected outcome is likely to happen more often. If you are the weaker team, you should play zone and try to muck it up and basically try to have noise take over the game. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, because I think people believe that man coverage gives rise to like sort of more interceptions and stuff like that. So I think from a man coverage standpoint, you should play less of it when you are weaker. Now, from a blitzing standpoint, that's a really good question. Like blitzing, stunts, all that kind of stuff. My guess would be that you want to blitz more when it's just because blitzing gives rise to more man coverage. So like that's kind of a little bit where I get worried, and that's why I immediately went to man coverage versus zone. I would find ways to get creative with rushes, and I would rush more, but I think on the back end where you have more, you have to have more zone coverage if you're the weaker team. And that's, a rule of thumb, not perfect, but kind of would keep me from saying being aggressive is what you want to do when you're the weaker team. I think you want to be a little bit, not defensive, but you want to give rise to more variance, which might mean more zone. Okay, so in my opinion, so this is Ron. In my opinion, this teardown in Minnesota is about 2 years overdue. When Courtney Cronin was here, she begged for it. So so why now? Courtney's a good friend, actually friend of Sumer as well. No, I agree. I mean, look, I think, and I'm I like Kwesi quite a bit. I think he's very smart. I'm rooting for him for sure as a friend, but I know that it's not necessarily his decision on everything. So I think that they've done a good job if you mod out by the fact that ownership always wants a winner in Minnesota. And like I grew up there, so I kind of know that they've only really been bad a handful of times in my life. And I think that for them being relevant all the time, and they, in the Kirk Cousins era, they've only played, I think, 2 games eliminated from the playoffs. They've only been, if you take out the playoffs, they've never been more than a 7-point underdog in any of Kirk Cousins' starts. So they're in it all the time, right? And I think that that's kind of their goal. And even though like analytically inclined folks like us might think, why not tear it down and build it up like the Bears have? But I don't. It's some realities here. Here's a good question with Sean as well. Pack the paint versus a press in basketball. If I have the worst players, I want to get in the muck versus better athletes you want to put pressure on. Yeah, that's a very good analogy here. Really, really enjoying the questions. Keep them coming in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read some of them from Twitter. Give me an opportunity here. I'm not going to post Twitter questions up here. Let me find some. This is a good one. This is from Ian at Ian_sportsdev. It says, how important is cornerback run stopping and tackling? Do PFF grades reflect the relative importance of those skills? So no, I don't think so PFF doesn't put value. Well, I take that back. They try to put some value into the plus minus grades, but for the most part, you should interpret those grades as how well did the player do adjusted for situation. I don't know if they adjust for situation quite as well as they should, but they at least try. But I don't think you should say because a guy has an 87 grade that they did that more valuably than another player. Like I don't think that that's a good enough lead. I think cornerback run stopping, I'd use it to break ties. If a guy's a wuss and he doesn't want to tackle, and he's an equally good cover corner as another guy, I'd obviously take the guy that can tackle. I don't think it's a be-all, end-all. I don't think that it's, like Marcus Peters never wanted to tackle anybody, but he was a great player for the Chiefs, and he made his fair share of plays. Run defense is a strong link system compared to some so run blocking is a weak link system. You just need to have one mistake in order to have a bad run play. And so on defense, you just need to sort of make one great play to stop the run. That's not necessarily true because run fits really do matter. But I think from a cornerback's perspective, like you're just there not to mess up, but also you can make a play or two punching the ball out, a la Pete Tillman. So I'll say like out of 10 run defense for a corner, outside guy, a nickel guy, has to be kind of a difference maker there a little bit. I would say it's like a 2.5 out of 10 in terms of importance. This is a great question from Sean. I wanted to talk about this as well because I have put up my simulation. Who is one team you are higher on than consensus and vice versa? So I will take some of these questions as well because we do have our simulation built out for Sumer, and that will be something that is available for people once they get a subscription to the Sumer Sports website in the fall. So just be out on the look for that. Green Bay is a team I'm higher on than a lot of people. I think win total 7.5. I think over that, if you look at FanDuel or DraftKings, is like I think there's like an 8% edge of going over there, which is a lot. Look, last year we really liked their defense going into the year. Everybody did. They flopped. I think defense is always a year late. So I think you still have talent there with Wyatt, Ken Clark, Gary coming back from an ACL. Hopefully that he can return. Preston Smith, Quay Walker came on at the end last year, and they got Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas, guys like that. So I think the defense will be pretty good. And I think Matt LaFleur is a much better coach than people give him credit for. I think that with respect to getting Rodgers to the MVP level. Now, I don't know if he's responsible for that entire leap from like where Rodgers was so mediocre he was going to be replaced to MVP 2 straight years, but I think he gets some of that credit, and I think he can make Jordan Love into not a great quarterback, but a good enough quarterback in the NFC. I mean, Dak, Hurts, Kyler, Stafford, Cousins, those are probably the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFC. And if Jordan Love can get within striking distance of that group, like they're in the playoffs. So I make Green Bay about 8.2 wins, 42% to make the playoffs, 26% to make the win of the division. So when they were 5-1, that was a really good gamble. So fair number would be like 4-1, 2% chance to win the Super Bowl, 3% chance to get first overall pick. So that's one. More broadly speaking, you have a strong preference for building front to back or back to front on the defensive side of the ball. Is pressure more important than coverage if forced to pick? Like this is another one where 2019, my colleague George Shahiri and I published an article about coverage versus pass rush. We've iterated on it a few times. Now, George and I no longer do a show together. He's still at PFF. I'm a Sumer now. But I'll say this. Coverage is more important as a unit than pass rush. The problem is that coverage is generally dictated by the 4th or 5th best player in your coverage unit, whereas pass rush is generally dictated by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd best player. So it's a strong link system versus a weak link system. So if I were to have to answer that question, I would say that that I would take a pass rusher first, and then I would take defensive backs for the next 4 or 5 picks. If there was a truly elite interior defensive lineman, I'd think about him later on. But I would try to get 1 pass rusher and then 4 coverage players. Is kind of the order I go. So that way my 4th coverage player is not weak. I can withstand that. I'm going to answer the second part of Sean's question. Who am I high? And he says, why the Colts? I actually don't mind the Colts here, Sean, and this is why. So if I look at strength of schedule, the 5 easiest strength of schedule teams, Atlanta's schedule is about a point easier per game on a neutral field than the average team. New Orleans in their same division, 1 point, about the same, about a point easier per game. Houston is about negative 0.92 points better than the average schedule, and then Indianapolis is 0.87 points worse. So they get a point a game based on their schedule. Their win total is 6.5. I'm more in that 7.4 range. I've told people a lot. I like Anthony Richardson with Shane Steichen. I think that's a great pairing. And so I'm a big fan there. Yeah, I think you could do a lot worse than the Colts in the betting markets this year. Jonathan Yang, is it possible not to build a roster without a hole in? It's basically not possible to build a roster without a hole in 1 to 3 position groups. Excluding running back, which position group are you willing to take an L on? Linebacker is probably the second one. I think you can do okay without great linebackers. I think the Rams showed that a couple years ago. Obviously great linebackers are why the San Francisco 49ers defense has been the way it's been for a decade and a half. But I think, not to say the linebackers don't matter. I'm just saying that, I think you could get by without a linebacker. I think you can get by. Guards are hard, but I think guard would be my next choice. And then I'd probably say tight end, but tight ends, again, it's tricky, right? I mean, it's really hard. Sean says, I am long Indy. Good. All right, cool. Hey, here's a team, not to be negative, but I at least was going to answer the second part of that question. I'm not exactly sure why Jacksonville is getting as much love as they are. I think, 9.5 wins is a really, we make them 55 to make the playoffs, 46 to win the division. The market's painting them the other direction. They're minus 150, minus 160 to win that division. And I get it. My rule of thumb, though, when I'm looking at futures is I don't think you really want to go into futures markets only with go into futures markets on a team because of what their schedule or their division looks like. I know that one last year with Washington and New York and those teams are truly easy schedules. They went over. I think that's, a very reasonable, take, but it more often than not fails. I think you have to really like something about a team to want to go over. And look, Trevor Lawrence can be amazing. Obviously, Doug Peterson is a very good coach, but I don't necessarily know if Jacksonville's got a ton going for them enough to lay a negative price for them to win their own division back-to-back for the first time since the Mark Brunell days. Okay, let's ask some other questions. I talked about with Sean. Sean, you messaged on Twitter. More appealing by the dip candidate Chase Young or Danielle Hunter. I think Danielle Hunter's easily there. What do you think about using pressures allowed for O-line evaluation? This is from Thea Goshak on Twitter. Could it lead to misleading interpretations because of the fact that it can be impacted by the quarterback play, even in true pass set situations? What could be a better way to evaluate O-line play? Well, I think people have tried. I mean, one thing that StatsBomb, I think, has done a cool job with one of my former interns who's now works with the Detroit Lions, Haley English. We were working on kind of looking at offensive linemen and how deep they pass set. So, using tracking data to sort of look at how deep they set. Brian Burke, of course, at ESPN built pass block win rate, which I think is a good metric. Generally speaking, though, those all like the same players. I think Pro Football Focus grades, when you look at them, they're different than pressures because you could give up a pressure because the quarterback was in the pocket too long, and they'll generally not charge that. They'll charge that to the O lineman, but they won't negate his grade. They'll give him a 0 or something on that play. And then there are plays where the guy gets beaten right away and the quarterback throws the ball, to the point of the question, which is that quarterbacks influence the pressure rate so much. But there are ways around it, like pass block win rate, PFF grade. Those, generally speaking, are very highly correlated with pressures because if you get beat a lot, you'll end up having more pressures allowed, but it's not perfectly correlated. So I would just say, to the questioner, I would just say find a ton of different ways to evaluate them and sort of weigh them. And I know Ben Baldwin has done that, and I think he's done a good job of highlighting some undervalued offensive linemen. Here's a question, Nicholas Pierce. Hey, Eric, if you are the 49ers, do you try to play Lance with all that was invested in him, or can you sit him and play Purdy, assuming Purdy's healthy? You play the best guy. I think at this point, we know that there's no sunk costs, in a sound decision. And so everything you've done for Lance is irrelevant at this point. And I know that that's not how people usually operate, but that's how you have to think. And in fact, you can use that against the league, because if Trey Lance, if we knew everything, if everything was known about Trey Lance, like he hadn't played really anything since 2019, he only has so many starts, he's injury prone, or he's not injury prone, but he got injured, no one would want it, right? If he had Brock Purdy's pedigree and Trey Lance's production so far, you wouldn't get anything for him. But since he has Trey Lance's pedigree, you can get something for him. You could probably get a second-round pick from the Vikings. You could probably get a third round pick from some team who has an injured or needs a backup. Let's say, I mean, I'm thinking about this, like what if you shipped him to Washington for Chase Young, right? That you know, I don't know how perfectly that would go down, but like that to me would be like if Washington's at the end of August and they're like, holy shit, our quarterbacks stink, then you could very much, I think that swap would really be beneficial. And the fact is again, you almost want to use the opposite of the sort of stem of this question for that is he's going to garner some respect in league circles in a trade because of what you invested in him in a weird way versus Purdy, who's probably more valuable to you than he is to any other team. Like I haven't talked the story. I actually want to have Sage on the podcast because he was the one that coached him up in the Shanahan system. Like I think he has more value to Shanahan than any other team, in which case you want to trade off the asset that has value to other teams as well. James Chamberlain, great stuff, Eric. What are the chances that Allen, Tua, and Rodgers play all 17 games? I think the Pats have the best roster since 2018 Super Bowl team. What are their odds to make the playoffs? Well, a good question. Let me look at New England here. I don't know if I agree with the premise necessarily that they have the best roster. We make New England about a 7.3 win team. We don't really see an edge in the markets. The markets have them at a 7.5 win team. We would give them a 25% chance to make the playoffs, a 10% chance to win their division, and about a 1% chance to win the Super Bowl. So it's a little bit longer shot. Now, their data is weird, right? Because you had one season where Mac Jones was fabulous. From my perspective as a rookie, he exceeded all my expectations. Then last year was quite bad, but how bad was it when you consider what they gave him in terms of play callers and stuff like that? You know, he's the classic case of when you're a young quarterback, you often give rise to your own sophomore slump because you play so well. Your offensive coordinator gets a head coach job, and then you are faced with having to run plays called by somebody else in year two, in addition to all the regression, gravity that you have in the first place. So that one's tough. I like what they do on offensive line. I like what they do, obviously, in the secondary. Really, really good stuff there. Judon remains one of the premier edge players in the league, I think. At wide receiver, that they go after Hopkins, that should really help them. At running back, I think Stevenson is a good player. So yeah, I mean, they're not terrible. I just think to answer your first question, yeah, I think Tua's a long shot to play every game. I think Allen is not because he's really, other than his rookie season, never been injured enough to miss time. Even last year when it looked like his elbow was really the problem, he never sat out. So I think he plays. And frankly, I think the Bills, when I look at Super Bowl odds, and I look at I make Buffalo fourth, a little ahead of Cincinnati, which I know the markets weren't, when we posted Sumer Sports, at the Bills were one of the favorites still to win the Super Bowl. After they lost to the Bengals, every Bengals fan lost their mind. But the Bills were 6-point favorites in that game against the Bengals. If you run it back, I think they win more than they lose. They're very much a contender. I think, I make Kansas City 18%, Philadelphia 17%, San Francisco 10%, Buffalo 10%, Cincinnati 8%. Those are, to me, the most likely 5 teams to win the Super Bowl. I think Buffalo still has a class there. I think that the Jets, what they're hoping for is what Tampa Bay did in 2020, where the Saints were a well-established team that hadn't really won anything in that era. They come in, kind of feel themselves out during the regular season, and then go ahead and play really well in the playoffs with a great quarterback. I think that's their goal. I'm not exactly sure about Miami. It's funny, the biggest game of the season, the biggest game of week one, no one's going to say this, but it's Miami versus Los Angeles Chargers. I think the team that wins that game's in the playoffs. I think the team that doesn't win, is going to have a long road to hoe. So a really good question there. Sean, again, how do you think the AFC NFC imbalance resolved itself? Is it just natural cycle? Like the AFC in the mid-90s, or could one of these elite quarterbacks who have not broken through try to jump the conferences? I think it's a great question. Burrow's not going anywhere. Herbert's not going anywhere. Rodgers, I think, will retire soon. Beyond that, it's still young guys. I mean, it's young people on the AFC side, and I don't think there's a mechanism to transfer them from one to the other. I mean, And I think if a player were to transfer from the AFC to the NFC, it would be one of the weaker guys, right? It would be kind of like a Kirk Cousins type player who's not a bad quarterback, but Kirk Cousins is not changing the complexion of the conferences that way. So no, I don't see it happen. And Anthony Richardson's like the highest upside player in that draft, and he went to the AFC as well. So I don't know how it shakes out. I mean, yeah, you're right. From like 1983 to 1997, there wasn't an AFC team that won the Super Bowl. Now there were good AFC teams: Buffalo, Kansas City, New England, among other teams that were. Denver made 3 Super Bowls before they won the one in '97. But yeah, I think it's going to be a while. I mean, you just can't dig out of the fact that your quarterbacks are all kind of mid-tier guys, and that's just really hard to resolve. So I think that's it for questions on the Twitter. Does anybody have? I'm gonna leave the chat open for another second here while I give out an ad for Manscaped. Okay, right. Father's Day is coming right up. Manscaped is your place to show your father, show your boyfriend, show your husband, show your friend who has one of those boyfriend, husbands, fathers, anybody that you care about them. Manscaped, the tools for the family jewels. Weed Whacker, my favorite Manscaped tool, helps me, take care of my nose hairs, my ears hairs, all that kind of stuff. The Lawnmower 4.0, 4th generation lawnmower for all of those delicate areas. You get 20% off with the promo code SUMER, SUMER. We really appreciate all of you that have supported the show through that. There will be another opportunity with another sponsor later on this summer to help support the show. So we really do appreciate all of you for joining today, for supporting Sumer Sports, and for going to Manscaped and getting your 20% off with promo code SUMER. Can't forget that, right? You can't forget to pay some bills here with the podcast. So this has been a lot of fun. I like doing these Friday shows, just kind of, chopping away, giving the listeners some access to some unfettered answers by me. This has been a really fun NFL offseason. We will get Thomas back in about a week, which will be great. I can't wait to chop it up with him on air. It's been not the same without him, of course. If you like what you heard today, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Tell a friend about the show. Subscribe on all your platforms. Leave a review, because I do read the reviews, especially if they are in the form of a question. So thank you all for joining the Sumer Sports Show.